Glad you're here. And so just to catch us up to where we came, of course, when you think of Genesis, well, let's just start at the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. No, we won't go through everything. Well, where we've been in our study is that Jacob had left his family's house because, and this is kind of key, you know how when you're watching one of those TV shows and it says previously on, that's what we're doing because it's kind of key. Remember Jacob, when he left his father's house, he left because he had caused some problems. Remember, he deceived his dad at his mom's, request, that he put goat's hair on his neck and goat's hair on the back of his hands, and he went in with the food mom prepared and basically said, I'm your son Esau. And he was there for the blessing, of course, and, what's your name? And my name is Esau, your son. And he says, you have the voice of Jacob, but, the smell of Esau, because he had Esau's clothes on, he had Esau's whatever, he's an imposter. And that's going to be pretty important. Well, anyway, so because he did that, his brother Esau was very angry with him because of the blessing that he'd stolen from him. And he didn't want to kill him while his parents were there to see it, so he basically was like, as soon as Dad dies, I'm going to kill my brother. And so Rebekah, being upset, not only that Esau was going to commit murder on his younger brother Jacob, but also because she was grieved, and her and Isaac both were grieved in heart at the wives that Esau had taken. And he'd taken wives from the Canaanites, and they were lewd women. It was just not a good scene. And so she didn't want, and this is how she sold to Isaac, I don't want my son to take wives from the Canaanites, send him to my brother Laban, and let him, take a wife from there. And so she basically told Jacob, go to my brother Laban's house for a few days. That was the thing, a few days. And I will, as soon as your brother calms down, he cools his jets, I will send for you. And so that was kind of the plan. So Jacob goes off. He finds himself at a well. The shepherdesses are coming out. He moves the stone off of the well for them to water their sheep. And he finds out that the woman that came to greet him there at the well was none other than Rachel, her sister's brother, his cousin, his sister's brother's daughter. And so, or his wife's, they're all just one big family. His wife's brother's daughter, Rachel. And so he lifts his voice up and weeps and kisses her. And of course, he, kind of like a love at first sight. He loves this girl, and he, kind of sets his eyes on her. And as he goes to work for his uncle Laban, he says, you shouldn't serve me for free. What are your wages going to be? And he says, I'll serve you for 7 years. This is the dowry. I'm going to work for 7 years' wages for your daughter Rachel. And you remember how it happened that after working 7 years, he's so excited, he's going to be married, and he gets married and goes into the tent. They consummate the marriage, and he wakes up, and lo and behold, it's not Rachel, right? she had the smell of Rachel at night. She had, the feel of Rachel, but then when he looks at her, she's Jacob. She's Rachel, right? She was Leah. And so he got the switcheroo happened to him. The same thing he tried to do to his dad happened to him, kind of in a sense of divine justice. It doesn't, like they say, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. And that's where Jacob was at. His name was Jacob, which means heel catcher or supplanter, or, somebody who trips you up, deceives you, and, he matches his name. Remember, his brother Esau says he's rightly called Jacob, for he deceived me, and he stole my blessing. And so this whole scene's going down, and he serves Laban another 7 years for his daughter Rachel. And, of course, he got to marry her before the 7 years started. So now he has 2 wives, 2 for the price of 1, then he, after the 7 years is complete, he starts to serve Laban for the livestock, and Jacob sets it up. He basically says, I will serve you for the livestock. You can take all of the ones that are plain, and I will, or all the ones that are speckled and spotted, and I will only receive from the birth of the livestock you have here, I'll only receive as my wages the speckled, spotted, and ring striped. And so as the livestock would go to conceive, God would cause them to have speckled, spotted, and ring striped rather than solid colors. And so as Laban's flock is dwindling, Jacob's is growing, and as it's growing, it tells us in the last chapter that Laban changed his wages 10 times. He's like, okay, well, you can have the ring striped, and you can have the speckled, you can have the spotted, and he kept changing it, but whatever Laban said, that's what they would bear. They would bear, and Jacob's flock, God had blessed him for that. Well, it got to the point where Laban's sons were saying, hey, he's taking away all of our inheritance. Our father's getting poorer. Our inheritances go to this guy. And so they began to whisper about him and get angry, and so Jacob realized it's time to go. And so God appears to Jacob and tells him, go back to your father's house, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And he gives him the promises that his fathers had. And so Jacob takes his wives out into the field where nobody can hear, and he says, hey, we're going to get out of here. And his wives agree, hey, our father has not, he spent our dowry. He didn't even save the money that he was supposed to save in case you passed away so we could live on it. He spent it all. And so what do we have here? What inheritance do we have here? And so they waited until Laban was on a 3-day journey in the opposite direction, and they took off without him. And of course Laban caught him and accused Jacob of all kinds of things, and Jacob had his words to say and Laban had his words to say, but God had warned Laban, do not say anything good or bad to Jacob, do not do evil to him, because he's following me. And so Laban basically sets it up to where they make an agreement. They put a pillar there saying, hey, I'm not going to cross this pillar, and you're not going to cross the pillar to do evil to one another. And so they made an agreement that they're not going to cross over to do evil to one another anymore. And so he leaves Laban behind, and Laban leaves, and Jacob is now heading back to his father's house. And so he finds himself between the rock of Mizpah and a difficult situation as he's facing now his brother Esau in the forefront. But as soon as Laban departs, it says in verse 1, so Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. Now, it's just kind of an interesting thing. He starts in on the direction that he's supposed to go to follow God. I'm in chapter 32, verse 1, in case I didn't say that. He's on his way to do what God has called him to do, and, in obedience, and now the angels of God meet him. And I don't know what this was like, but obviously it was pretty spectacular. This host of angels meets him. Now he has a company of people that are trying to move, and then all of a sudden he meets this company of angels. And I don't know what that was all about. He just sees them. Maybe the favor of God or whatever. God's showing him, I'm with you, I'm protecting you. And I think it's an interesting thing. We don't really think, I don't know if you think about angels very much, but, angels apparently are all around us. And they're ministering spirits to minister to those, the Bible tells us, who are inheriting salvation. And so no doubt you have an angel that follows you around and keeps you out of trouble sometimes. Maybe that's that time you thought you were going to get in a wreck, and all of a sudden, something happened and you near miss, I don't know. But it's kind of interesting. Angels are all around us. I mean, this room, for all we know, could be completely filled with angels, and we wouldn't know it. It's kind of crazy to think about. Maybe you remember the story in 2 Kings chapter 6 when, basically the king, he hears that this Elisha, is thwarting his plans because he hears even the things that go on inside of the bedroom of this king, and he's just so irate, he sends an army to go get Elisha. And Gehazi, which is Elijah's servant, goes out and he looks and he sees this host of army just coming down the mountain, and he's just like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And Elijah, of course, the servant of God, says, do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And, of course, his servants are like, are you crazy? There's no way. And Elijah prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened his eyes, the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So when the Syrians came down to him, Elisha prayed, and the Lord said, strike the people, I pray, with blindness. And he struck them with blindness according to the word of the Lord of Elisha. Or according to the word of Elisha, rather. And so, it's interesting. Angels are there, to protect. And no doubt this was a sign to Jacob, hey, no matter where you're going, no matter what is going to, befall you, there's more with you than there are with them. And I don't know that he understood that. It's interesting how quickly we can forget an experience like this. And I don't know if you've ever gone through something and the Lord just totally, miraculously provided for you, or got you out of a tight spot, or made things happen for you that you thought could never happen, and all of a sudden the doors open, and you're like, this is amazing, and then the water bill is late, or you don't have enough money to pay the water bill, and you freak out, right? It's just funny how we are that way, God shows us these amazing things. The children of Israel coming out of the land of Egypt with the mighty right hand of God and all the plagues that God poured out on the Egyptians to bring them to the promised land, and they get out into the wilderness, they thirst, and they cry and say, God, you've brought us out here to die. So quickly do we go from a place of seeing God's provision, seeing God work, and when God allows things to be a little bit tight or a little bit difficult or a little bit hard, sometimes we just feel like God's out to get us, don't we? And we deserve that. That's why we feel that way, I think. We know that we're not a good person, deep inside, and we know that we don't deserve God's blessings. And so, of course, God would punish us. But what would God require of us? And I think that that's an important question to answer. Yes, you deserve to be punished. Yes, you deserve hell. That's the best you deserve. But Jesus was punished for you, right? Jesus took all of the pain, all of the anguish, all of the beating that you deserved, the death that you deserved to die, and he died in your place. And if God would not spare his own Son, but deliver him up for us all, how shall he not in him also freely give us all good things? Romans chapter 8, right? He promises us these amazing promises that he will be with us. And he tells us in the book of Hebrews, whoever the author of Hebrews is, Paul probably, he tells us, don't have an evil heart of unbelief, departing from the living God. And so for us, when it comes to the things that pertain to this life and the difficulties that we face, we have to remember that he who is for us is greater than he who is against us. That he who is in us is greater than he who is in the world. If God is for us, who could be against us? And that's what we have to remember as Christians. And sometimes it's a time to repent, right? But if we repent and confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us of our sins. And so we can move forward in confidence and move forward in faith, trusting God for what comes next. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because sometimes God will allow difficulty in our lives, because oftentimes when difficulty comes into our lives, that's when we cling to God more, right? That's when we're turned to God. And God knows that if things go too easy for you, and everything's just smooth sailing, all the way, that you're going to, get less and less accustomed to needing God. And so he'll allow roadblocks. He'll allow these things. It's interesting, though, because I do talk to people sometimes, and they say, God never answers my prayers. You know what that tells me about that person? That tells me that person doesn't pray. That person only prays 911 prayers. You know how I know that? Because when you are praying about everything, you'll see God answering prayers. If you only pray when you're in trouble, God might answer it, He might not, but a lot of times, eventually He will bring an answer solution. There are things that my wife and I have been praying for 20 years. And we're still waiting for. I remember about 18 years into it, we've been praying for something for 18 years, and God finally answered it. It's amazing how God will answer prayers, but there are some things we pray for, and like instantly, the Lord answers the prayer. And so if you don't believe God answers prayer, it just means you don't pray enough. Because He doesn't answer every prayer right now. This isn't McDonald's, right? This is God, and He wants to be involved in every area of our lives, even the smallest things. And so when we get accustomed to praying and asking God for things, we'll get accustomed to seeing Him work within our lives in ways that are unexpected sometimes. And sometimes big things He'll answer right away, but if you are accustomed to taking everything before the Lord, Romans 3, 5, and 6, lean not on your own understanding, or trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. If you don't have that relationship with the Lord, then you're going to find yourself grasping for Him when you're not used to coming to Him, which is not a good place to be in. So Jacob sees this huge company of angels, and it's interesting because when you look at everything that's happened while Jacob was with Laban, it doesn't really mention his prayer life. It doesn't really mention his relationship with the Lord. We see a couple of times where Laban says, I know through divination that I am blessed because of you. I think your translation probably says experience, but the word experienced in Hebrew is divinations. I know through, or enchantments. I know through my enchantments that I'm blessed because of you, that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. But we don't really see Jacob's relationship with the Lord so much. We see him trying to scheme. We see him trying to do things. The Lord appears to him and speaks to him, but he doesn't really talk about the Lord. And now it's going to change a little bit as we look at this. In verse 2 it says, when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. And he called the name of that place Mahanaim, which means, or Mahanaim, which means two camps. And what he's seeing is he's seeing a camp of angels and a camp of his people, is what he's seeing. And so he's saying, hey, this isn't just our camp, this is God's camp too. It's interesting, these are the experiences that Jacob had. When he was leaving to go to his uncle Laban, I remember he laid his head on a rock and he had a vision or a dream, and he saw a ladder going to heaven and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the ladder. And he says, this is none other than the house of God. He calls the place Bethel, which means house of God. And so when Jacob's moving, God is meeting him in those places. God is establishing a relationship with Jacob. It says, verse 3, then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother, to the land of Seir of the country of Edom. And so as I mentioned before, his mother said, when things are good, I'll send for you. It's been 20 years. 20 years, and nobody's ever come. Nobody's ever said, hey, Esau's really good now. All clear. Come on in. 20 years. His mom hasn't seen this grudge lift. Esau's anger taken away. Can somebody hold a grudge for 20 years? You guys are all too confident about that. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know. No, it was interesting. One time I was, when we very first started the church, there was a couple, they're an older couple here at the church, and this lady, young gal with a baby, I can't remember what she did, but she said something or did something, and this old guy kind of grumped at her. It's like, oh yeah, I remember your baby. Just started basically complaining to her I think about the baby fussing or something like that and her not dealing with it in the way that he expected her to. And his wife said, "You jerk." You could see this like flame in her eyes, and she said, "You said the same thing when our son was a baby." Their son was 21 years old. And I'm thinking, wow. And she was just like, he was astonished. It's like, it took her 20 years to finally say, "I've had enough of that," And it can, it builds, bitterness and holding on to bitterness and grudges and revenge. What does it do for us? What does a grudge do for somebody? I don't know what it is, but it's so satisfying, isn't it? To feel angry. There's something about being angry and holding on to something that tickles a very evil part of our heart. And we love that feeling. We just want to hold on to it. We don't want to let it go, and we just mull it over. How do you know if you're bitter? If you have a grudge, how do you know? Bitterness remembers details. If you've played it over in your mind again and again and again, and I said this, and then they did that, and then I said this, and this happened, this is why I was wrong, and you remember it so clearly, it's because you're probably bitter, because bitterness remembers details. And so how do you get rid of that? And I think it's kind of an important, even though that's not really what our text is about, but it does happen. But I think it's important to just talk about this, because you've probably heard me say this before, but if you haven't, and maybe you're holding on to bitterness, there's a way to get rid of bitterness. First thing you do is you confess it as sin. You have to confess bitterness as sin. Why is it sin? Because it falls short of God's glory. Think about it. Jesus died on the cross, and who did he forgive? Everybody. And by holding on to bitterness and holding on to a grudge, I am saying my standard of forgiveness is higher than that of God's. And that's not a good place to be, right? Now, I want to be careful here, because I know that sometimes when somebody does something to you that is evil, it is very evil. Maybe you were a child and somebody hurt you, or maybe you were vulnerable and somebody took advantage of you, and you were honestly wronged. And what happened to you should never happen to anybody, and it is not something that is to be taken lightly. I agree with that. But it's kind of like a dirty trick, because when we hold on to bitterness because of what somebody else did to us, it puts us on the wrong side of God, doesn't it? He says, "Forgive as you have been forgiven. If you do not forgive, I will not forgive you." That's not a good place to be. And so what do we do with that? What was done to us was wrong. Well, first of all, you have to realize that when you hold on to a grudge, you're only allowing the person who hurt you to continue to hurt you. Because bitterness actually makes you sick, physically sick. It releases toxin within your body that eat your bones, that cause you to die young. You're actually allowing the person who hurt you to continue to hurt you. The thing that it's counterintuitive, but the thing that's true is that when you have released your obligation to be angry with that person, you are releasing basically the power that person has over you. And it's so important to realize. I have a friend who's a pastor's wife. This pastor and his wife are friends with Shannon and I, have been for years and years and years, probably 22 years. We've known them. And the pastor's wife was molested when she was a child, all through her childhood, by her brother. And he would hold it over her. He actually, at family reunions, every time they were together, into her adulthood, he would say, nobody knows but me and you, and just torment her with the knowledge that he had this power over her, that he had taken advantage of her as a child. And she didn't tell her husband, she didn't tell anybody, until finally somebody, a counselor, says, you know what you need to do is you need to forgive him, and you need to tell your husband and tell your family. And so she did, and when she did, she said the burden of that just released. And she said, she started to lose weight. She started to feel better about herself. She just started to thrive as a person. It was amazing what that did for her. And then at the next family reunion, her brother came and he's like, nobody knows. She's like, actually, no, everybody knows now. I told everybody and I forgive you. And he was mortified. He was absolutely mortified. And I don't know what happened to him at that point, but could you imagine? The reality is that if you can let go of it, you can be free. Now, how do you let go of it? Because, that's the hard part, isn't it? I don't think that it's actually possible in every circumstance. I don't think it's possible for us to say, okay, well, hey, no big deal. I forgive. Because it is a big deal, isn't it? It's a huge deal. And so how do you forgive? You confess it as sin, and then you ask God to give you His forgiveness for that person. I have seen people that are bitter for years and years and years over some of the most awful things that have happened to them, and in an instant, when they surrendered it to Jesus and said, Jesus, I need you to put the forgiveness in my heart. I need your forgiveness. Because when we don't have it, when we don't have whatever it is that's needed for life and godliness, Jesus makes it available to us. 2 Peter chapter 1 tells us that we have all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of Him. And one of those things is forgiveness. And when we can't forgive, He can forgive. He can give us His forgiveness and put it in our heart, and we can be released. And it's amazing to see people set free from that when they'll just say, you know what, Jesus, I give this to you. So now we have this situation where, apparently he's been bitter for 20 years, and Jacob is pretty afraid. It says, verse 4, and he commanded them, saying, speak thus to my lord Esau, thus your servant Jacob says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, and male and female servants I have sent to tell my lord that I may find favor in your sight. Then the messenger returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he also is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. Well, you're fired. That's the first thing you're fired, to these poor guys. What in the world? He's like, hey, go tell him. I don't know if Esau knew or if it's because they told him that Esau's coming. It's hard to say what transpired or how this whole thing went down. But Esau is coming with 400 men. What could that mean? What could that mean? Isn't that the way that it is? You see this amazing company of angels. Oh, man. God is with me. And you're so excited. And something just happened for you, and it's so awesome, and you're like, oh, man, this is awesome. And then you hear the bad news. This is coming down the pike. This bill's coming due. Or this is what happens. Or, we just wrecked our car. Or whatever it is. And now you're thinking, oh, no. I'm lost. God's abandoned me. This is how he feels. Go and tell him that his brother's coming. And so they send him off to Edom, was where Esau was living. And they come back with this report. Hey, guess what? He's coming. He has 400 guys with him. So Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. And he divided the people that were with him, the flocks and the herds, the camels, into two companies. And he said, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company, which is left, will escape. It's almost like Jacob is like dividing himself to be conquered. I'm going to just put these poor folks up front, and if he kills all of them, then the rest of us can run away. Not such a good plan. But this is what it drives Jacob to, and this is what's really beautiful. In chapter 9, Jacob takes his fear, and rather than trying to further fix the problem or further do some sort of ingenuity, which is always kind of what he's done, it says, verse 9, then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country and to your family, and I will deal well with you. And so this is what he does. He reminds God of God's promises. And I think that this is important for us because sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where we are troubled with what we see on the outside. The natural circumstances seem impossible. And this is where we have to remind God of what He's told us. And why are we reminding God of what He's told us? Because God forgot. No, because we are having trouble believing it at this point. And so really what we're doing when we're reminding God of what He's told us, we're reminding ourselves. God told me this. God, you told me this. Remember that? Okay, help me to believe it. Help me to trust you. And He's saying, hey, you told me I was going to go and everything was going to be okay. And now all of this is happening. What's going on? But I love what He says in verse 10, and I think that this is so important. This is why we have such a difficult time when bad things happen. Notice what He says, I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown your servant, for I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. He's saying, when I came into this land, when I started out, all I had was this staff. Now, it's interesting because this staff is going to be with Jacob from the first day until the last. You'll see in Genesis chapter 49 when he takes that staff and he draws his feet up into his bed and he dies. And he'll have that staff till the very end. This is the one thing he's clinging to. And sometimes, certain things in our lives can be a constant, and that's what his staff was. But he says, I started out with just this staff, and now I have all of this. You've blessed me far beyond. I'm not worthy of the least of your mercies. And I think that this is where, as Christians, where we always have to be. You see, I've heard people say, and I've watched Christians, and they will say stuff, and maybe even I've said stuff, God, why are you allowing this to happen to me? And that's kind of a funny statement, isn't it? Because honestly, we don't deserve even the least of His mercies. And so the question should be, when good things are happening, God, why are you blessing me so much? I don't deserve any of this. And yet He does, oftentimes. Bless us when we don't deserve it. And sometimes we go through difficult times, but it's always good to remain in that perspective, though no matter how things are going, no matter how bad it gets, I deserve worse. And if we can keep that perspective and realize that when good things happen to me, it's all God's mercy, it's all God's blessing, I'm not worthy of the least of His mercies, and yet because of His grace, because He is good, He is blessing my life. And when good things happen to me, it's because He loves me enough to send His own Son to die for me. And you have to realize that that's where we are with God. But His promises are real. And so He says, I'm not worthy of the least of your mercies that you have shown your servant, for I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I've become two companies. I have all this. And then He says, verse 11, deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother and from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me and the mother with the children. Now, is it necessary for him to pray this? This is a question. People ridicule him for doing this. But I don't. I don't think for an instant that what he's saying here is out of line. Maybe he's failing in faith. We all fail in faith, don't we? At times. If you had 400 people coming towards you, 401, and the one was the one you're really afraid of. But you have 401 coming at you, the big hairy one in the middle, that's the one you got to watch for. Would you not be afraid? You found out, you got a phone call, hey, there's 400 people coming over your house right now, they're going to rip you apart. I mean, wouldn't that freak you out? Wouldn't you pray this prayer? God, you told me you'd protect me. We'd pray. And so he's praying. What I love about this is that he's saying, God, protect me from this. And he's inquiring of the Lord. Now, it's interesting as you think about what happens within the Bible. Remember when God told them, go into the promised land, take the promised land? And so they did. They went in. They marched around the city of Jericho. And after the seventh day, they marched around 7 times. And then what happened? The city fell. They attacked the city. They had a great victory. And then, right after that, They went and attacked who? Ai. And they conquered them, right? No, they got their tushies kicked. And they even sent a smaller group because it's just a little city. So we're just going to send a smaller group to, 20,000 guys or something like that to destroy this city of 6,000 people. And they got beat and guys died. Why did they get killed? It wasn't because Achan had stolen. That's not why. The reason they died was because they didn't inquire of the Lord. They just presumed. God said He was going to give us the promised land. March forward. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread, right? And they rushed in to do it. David, if you notice David's life, when David was king over Israel, he always inquired of the Lord. And every time he inquired of the Lord, he'd say, Lord, is this guy going to kill me? And the Lord would say, yeah, he's going to kill you. Get out of there. Or he'd say, God, will you give us this city? Yeah, take the city. It's yours. But he always inquired of the Lord. And I think that this is an essential element. Lord, my brother, I'm afraid of him. He's coming at me with 400 guys. Will you protect me? And the Lord could have said, you know what, Jacob? Run that direction. Or He might have said, stay. And, if your brother attacks you, I'll fight for you and you'll win. But he inquires of the Lord. And I think it's so important as Christians that we always inquire of the Lord. He inquires of the Lord. He says, I'm afraid of him. He's honest before the Lord. He's going to kill me, and he's going to kill the mother with the children. Now, the reality is Jacob knew my life isn't as important as these kids, right? Because it's through the kids that God is going to bring about His promises. Now that I've had kids, my life is expendable. And so he's saying, hey, they're not going to just kill me. They're going to kill their moms. They're going to kill the children. He gives it to the Lord. For you said, I will surely treat you well and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. And so he reminds God, you told me of the promises that you were going to make with my children. So he lodged there that same night and took what came to his hand as a present for Esau his brother. 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 milk camels. He can have those as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if I want to drink any camel's milk. I kind of like the goat kind, the goat kind's not bad. Cow kind is my favorite. With their colts, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 foals. This is quite the gift. If you had 10 camels in that day, you were considered wealthy. And so you see the wealth, and this is what Jacob is saying. You have blessed me beyond measure. We're not just a small herd. We are two massive groups of people with livestock and everything. And so he takes a portion of that. And we don't know how much of it was, but we do know that it was just a small portion of all that he had. And he sends hundreds of livestock to his brother. And it says, verse 16, then he delivered them to the hand of his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass over before me and put some distance between successive droves. And he commanded the first one, saying, when Esau my brother meets you and asks you, saying, to whom do you belong, and where are you going? To whose are these in front of you? And then you are to say, they are your servant Jacob's. It is a present sent by my lord to my lord Esau, and behold, he is also coming behind us. So he commanded the second and the third, and all who followed the drove, saying, in this manner you shall speak to Esau when you find him. And also say, behold, your servant Jacob is behind us, for he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. Now, we don't know why he does this. Is this because God told him to do this? Not necessarily. But, honestly, this is the way I find things to be. When I pray for something, here's just a tangible example. There's times, believe it or not, in my marriage when I feel like there's distance between my wife and I. I feel like, I just don't feel like we're connecting. We're like strangers in the night. We're so busy that we just don't talk, and we fall down exhausted at night, and we hold hands to pray, and then we both fall asleep, and it's like we haven't seen each other in literally months, and so we feel disconnected from each other. And so whenever I start feeling like that, I always pray, Lord, show me how to love my wife. I pray that. If I'm ever feeling like distant from her, like I'm a stranger to her, I always start praying, God, show me how to love my wife. Show me what I can do for her. And then he doesn't say, Mike, you idiot, buy her flowers or something like that. He doesn't ever give me that, direct, instruction. But after I've prayed, believing that God hears me and God cares that I have a good marriage, I just do whatever I feel like the Lord is putting on my heart. If flowers come to mind, I do that. If I need to take her on a date, I call for a babysitter. I pray, and I know that He knows what to do more than I know what to do. He's the manufacturer. She's fearfully and wonderfully made. I don't understand what's going on there. She has, buttons and gizmos that I don't even understand. I don't want to touch the wrong thing or push the wrong button. And so I just ask the manufacturer, hey, how do I get to go down this road? And he's like, oh yeah, I just do this. And so then he tells me what to do, and the next thing you know, marital bliss is back in shape. And so it may just be that God is speaking to Jacob, hey, show him your intentions by sending these gifts. And it's just what came to his mind. God didn't tangibly say, do it, but he just felt that was the right thing to do. And his results are going to be actually very favorable. So, verse 21, the present went on over before him, but he himself lodged that night in the camp. And he arose that night and took his 2 wives and 2 female servants and his 11 sons and crossed over the ford Jabbok. He also took them, sent them over the brook and sent over what he had. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. That's weird. Just all of a sudden. Could you imagine? So Jacob, he puts his camps, he crosses over the river, and then he sends his kids and his wives over a little brook off into the dark. And he's just by himself, all over in the dark, and he's just sitting there. And probably every little snap of a twig or rustle of a bush is freaking him out, because he's thinking, Esau's going to be here, he's going to grab me, and he's going to kill me. He's afraid. And he doesn't know what's going down. And so he's in the dark by himself, and all of a sudden, thunk, somebody grabs him and starts to wrestle with him. And would this not freak you out? This is the weirdest thing in the world. All of a sudden he has somebody rolling around in the dust with him, and he's wrestling with him until daybreak. I don't know if you've ever wrestled, but it's tiring. Just grabbing on and trying to get the other guy to flip, and you're working all these muscles to try to flip him or turn him or get him to where you can pin him, and you're putting out a lot of energy. I mean, you can imagine all night long. A wrestling match, goes in 3-minute intervals, right? Or something like that. They grab on each other for 3 minutes, and then they change positions, they go again. But it's not like all night long. Can you imagine how tired he must have been? He's like a boxer who's hanging onto the other guy, just hoping he can just hang in there, won't give up. And he's just not giving up. Now, you'll notice, it's interesting, in verse 24, you'll notice in your translation that the word man is capitalized. At this point, he's probably thinking, I wish I was surrounded by all of my servants. I wish I wouldn't have gotten alone. Some dude grabbed me in the middle of the night, started wrestling with me. So it says verse 25, now when he saw that he did not prevail against him. Now, this isn't Jacob seeing that he's not prevailing, but it's the man who's grabbed Jacob sees that he's not prevailing against him. In other words, this guy just won't give up. Now, I have a son like this. I literally, my son, he will not, and I've seen him do this with me, I've seen him do this with other kids, I've seen him do this with other adults, and he will not give up until you make him give up. Until you do something that either he's crying or he's, pinned down. But if you unpin him and he's not crying, then he's going to come after you again. He won't stop. He's just one of those kids. He just will not stop. So he's wrestling with him. This guy's grabbed Jacob in the middle of the night. He's wrestling with him till daybreak, and Jacob will not relent. He won't let go. He wasn't winning necessarily. He just wasn't giving up. He wouldn't stop wrestling. It says he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip went out of joint as he wrestled him. And no doubt at this moment Jacob is noticing something is wrong with this guy. This guy has been beating me all night. I can't prevail against him, but I'm not going to let him win. No matter what, I'm not going to let him win. And then all of a sudden the guy just touches his hip, and his hip goes out of socket. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a joint out of socket. Something's gone out of socket. The hip is the worst I've heard. The hip is the most painful joint in your body to go out of socket. There was a guy who had he wrecked on a motorcycle in the sand. He had a shoulder out of socket, and he had a hip out of socket. And he says he put his full weight on his shoulder that was out of socket to get his weight off of his hip that was out of socket, because it was so painful. The hip pain was so bad that he didn't notice the shoulder pain. And so you just think about this. His hip's out of socket, and yet, with his hip out of socket, the guy who put his hip out of socket says, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." It's interesting. So who is this guy? Now, most of you probably already know, but if you've never studied this passage, you're probably wondering, who is this guy? This guy that's wrestling with him is none other than God himself, which is really bizarre, but that's what we find here. God wrestled with Jacob. In fact, Hosea would say this in Hosea 12:3. He took his brother by the heel in the womb, significant, and in his strength he struggled with God. Yes, he struggled with the angel and prevailed, capital A, angel of the Lord. And whenever we see that, remember when Joshua would come across this man, and it was the angel of the host, or the angel of the hosts of God's armies, and he says, "Are you with us, or are you with our enemies?" And I love what the angel says. He says, "No." Take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground. It was an Old Testament appearance of Jesus Christ. The angel of the Lord oftentimes was the Lord. Now, the word angel just means messenger, but Jesus appears several times in the Old Testament, so he is wrestling literally with Jesus. And Jesus puts his hip out of socket, and Jacob realizes, I am wrestling with somebody greater than I am. Somebody who can give me a blessing, and maybe he understands somewhere in his mind. It says in Hosea 12:4, just the second part of this, he says, he wept and sought favor from him, and he found him in Bethel, and there he spoke to us. And so he remembers he found him originally in Bethel, the house of God, where he saw the angel ascending and descending. And now he's struggling with him, and he's weeping. And the Greek is that while he was wrestling, while he was struggling, he was weeping and asking for a blessing. He wouldn't let go. So, verse 27, this is a key verse. He said to him, "What is your name?" What is he asking for? He's asking for a blessing. What is your name? Why is it significant that he asks him what his name is? Does anybody know? Last time he was seeking for a blessing, what did he say his name was? Esau. I'm Esau, your firstborn. So now he's wrestling with God, and God says, "What is your name?" He has to come clean. He has to, it's just like Peter, who denied the Lord 3 times, and he comes back to the Lord, and the Lord, he sets him straight. I love that passage in John 21, when they're on the beach, and Peter, he's in the boat, and he's fishing, and then all of a sudden, Jesus is on the shore, and he says, "Cast your net on the other side." So they cast the net on the other side, and they pulling this huge, and we've been fishing all night and caught nothing, and they cast their net in and they get this big haul of fish and the nets are ripping. And they're trying to pull it in. And Peter's the one who's always overzealous. The guys are all trying to pull it in, and Peter just jumps into the water, takes off his tunic, jumps into the water, and swims to shore. Not bold enough to ask, let me walk on the water to you. He just swims, right, this time. And he meets Jesus there on the shore, and Jesus says to him, Peter, do you love me more than these? Remember, he denied him 3 times. First time he says, do you love me more than these? He says, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. Or feed my lambs. I can't remember, he says different things each time. But then he says again, Peter, do you love me more than these? And he says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And he says, feed my lambs. He says, do you love me more than these? And Peter was sad that the 3rd time he said, do you love me more than these? And he says, Lord, you know all things. I love you. And he says, feed my sheep. So what's significant about that is that Jesus is meeting Peter where he is. He restores him. He asked him 3 times. He denied him 3 times. Now he's asking him 3 times, do you love me? And so there's this equity in it all. But he also makes Peter be honest. Because he doesn't actually say, do you love me, in the way that we would think. Jesus says, do you love me? Do you agape me, Peter, more than these? Agape being God's perfect love. And Peter says, Lord, you know I admire you. Phileo, I admire you. 2nd time Jesus says, Peter, do you agape me? And he says, Lord, you know I admire you. I phileo you. And the 3rd time Jesus says, Peter, do you phileo me? And he was grieved that the 3rd time Jesus said phileo. You see, Peter couldn't bring himself to say agape because he knew that his love was not perfect, like Jesus' love. And so he says, yes, Lord, I phileo you. And he says, feed my lambs. You know, it's interesting, but in that case and in this case, He's making Peter come clean, and yet at the same time He's restoring him. And here Jacob says, my name is Jacob. And he has to admit it, because the word, again, Jacob, means supplanter or heel catcher. My name is deceiver. My name is scoundrel. My name is rightly so called Jacob, as his brother said. Because I've lied, I've cheated, I've stolen, I've manipulated. And now he's struggling with God, and he comes clean and says, my name is Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. You know, and I think that that's a very, very important point to make. You know, as we look at this and you think of your own life, you're wrestling with God, you're trying to manipulate things, and it isn't until you're ready to come clean. God, I failed. God, I am a sinner. God, I have wrecked my life. I am what I am. And then God says, I want to make you something else. You see, we never become clean until we admit that we're a sinner, do we? We can't become a child of God until we admit that we're a child of the devil. And once we admit that we are a sinner and we are in need of grace and we are in need of salvation, that is when the forgiveness comes. That is when God gives us a new life, a new name, if you will. And we're born again of the Spirit of God. And Jesus' blood can be applied to our life. But without confession, there is no salvation. So we confess, and then we believe, and then we are saved. And so he says, you prevailed against God and man. Then Jacob asked, saying, tell me your name, I pray. And he said, what is it that you ask about my name? Or why is it that you ask my name? And he blessed him there. So God never told him his name. God doesn't have to, does he? He just forget about it. And he blessed him, you know, which is awesome. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, For, and this shows that Jacob knew what had just happened to him. He says, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And that's pretty significant. I didn't die. And that's the thing. God is holy. God is perfect. And you never want to stand in the presence of God without the covering of Jesus, right? Moses, wanting to see God's glory, says, man cannot see my glory and live. No man can see my face and live. And so Moses only got to see the afterglow of God's glory. And so this is a pretty significant moment. He's saying, he calls the place the face of God. That's what Peniel means. And he says, I've seen the face of God, and I've been preserved. My life has been preserved. Just as he crossed over, verse 31, just as he crossed over Peniel, the sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. And so God gives him this little reminder of his wrestling with God. Therefore, to this day, the children of Israel do not eat the muscle that shrank, which is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip in the muscle that shrank. I think it's important that we realize that you don't mess with God, and that you follow Him, you trust the Lord with all your heart, you follow Him with all your heart, you love Him with all your heart, because God loves you enough that when you stray, He's willing to dislocate your hip. I was driving to work one time. I worked at Pebble Creek, a ski area. It was an awesome job. Got to ski as much as I wanted to. All day long. I worked the night shift, and so I got to ski all day and then work the night shift, and it was just an awesome, awesome job. And I got a little cocky. I'm not going to lie. I was a little cocky about my abilities in skiing and girls and everything else that went along with that job. It was just a lot of temptation there, and I was a brand new Christian. And I remember driving to work one day, and I was listening to J. Vernon McGee. And J. Vernon McGee was telling the story about how when a shepherd in Israel would have a lamb that would continue to stray away, he would leave the 99 and find the one that strayed. And what he would do was take that little lamb, and he'd take its leg and break it. And then he would set it and wrap it and put that lamb on his shoulders. And he carried that lamb until that leg was set. And then once the leg was set, he put the lamb down, and that lamb would never leave his side. It attached. And I thought, what a cute story. As I'm driving to work. And, things were happening in my life. I remember at one point, we went night skiing after hours. We're not supposed to do that. I went night skiing. We'd ride the cat up with the cat driver, and we'd ski down at moonlight on a full moon. Awesome. If you ever have the chance to do that. But we weren't supposed to be doing that, but we did it. No ski patrol on patrol, right? And do that. And then we'd sit in the lodge, and I was only 18, but, the guys would be having a beer, and there's no cops around. So I thought, hey, why not? I drink a beer with the guys. I just want to be cool. I don't want to be irrelevant. I want to be able to share the faith and know that Jesus isn't stiff, right? I made all these excuses in my head, And one day, not long after that, I was skiing down, and my boss actually said, hey, I want you to start working, but just take one more run. And I thought, well, I want to eat too, so I'm going to go fast. And so I was going really fast. And I hit what they call a death cookie, which is just a big chunk of ice. And I remember spinning around, and I had my bindings on a little tighter. I could go to the ski shop, down to the ski shop and, adjust my own skis and stuff. So I had them a little bit tighter so I could ski a little bit faster. And they were a little bit too tight, and my ski binding didn't come off, and my knee popped. And I'm laying there on the ground thinking to myself, God just broke my leg. It was just so real. And so I got up. Nobody's around. I'm kind of off in a place where nobody else is near, and there's no ski patrol or anything. And I thought, it must just be bruised. So I just skied down on my right leg and held my ski over my shoulder and just skied down. And I remember standing there on my leg, and I put my pole down and popped my binding out, and I was just gonna try to walk, and I went to walk, and my leg just folded out from underneath me, and I collapsed. And they put me in this board, and they took me home and all that, and so I ended up having to have ACL repair and just a big mess. But during that time, where I was, kind of waiting for surgery, and my recovery time was really long because they wanted my meniscus to heal naturally, which it never really did. But they wanted it to heal naturally, so they didn't do surgery on the meniscus. And so I had to be basically set up for 6 weeks without getting off the couch. And so during that time, I would listen to sermons and went into physical therapy, and the recovery time was really long. And so I would just find a Bible study every night of the week. I just go to a Bible study. And during that time, I just drew really, really close to the Lord. And so you'll notice I'm standing on my right leg because I hardly ever stand on my left leg, because even though that was 23 years ago that I did that, or 24 years ago now, I still favor this leg. I know that at any minute it could pop out from underneath me. In fact, you probably remember a couple years ago when on the day of my 18th anniversary, I told Shannon we were going to go somewhere expensive, and I held to it because I took her to the emergency room to have my meniscus finally removed after years and years and years. But, that's the way the Lord does. And constant reminder, always remembering, every time I walk on this knee and it doesn't feel super stable, that I belong to the Lord. And so too Jacob would find himself with this constant limp for the rest of his life. And every time he would limp, every time that hip would pinch, I belong to God. Let's pray.